It sounds like, Marcus, I think gets us into the conversation about public value quite easily, because when you're
Yep.
talking about that bigger thing, and that
Yep.
thing that your organization,
Yeah.
that your government is trying to
Yeah.
address, and
Yep.
the interesting thing I've always thought about public value, it exists at the governmental level, at the
Right.
organizational level, at the unit
Right.
level, and in the
Right.
individual. And
Absolutely.
I firmly believe that in many organizations, I think you do get a decoupling between the
Yep.
processes and the value that's been
Yep.
generated over time. I
Yep.
believe that one of the things that the sense of urgency in a crisis can do is it can bring those two things together.
Yes.
I think
Absolutely.
I think it actually has to. My
Yes.
feeling is that if the people who are involved in this don't understand the value that they're trying to produce, they can either find themselves really
Right.
buckling when the pressure gets too
Right.
much, or they
Yeah.
could actually find themselves making mistakes,
Mm.
solving the crisis in certain ways, but in ways that really exacerbate other things that matter.
That's the hard one.
And that
That's
is the
the really
hard,
hard one.
yeah. And
Yep.
one of the things that I do watch, for instance, at the moment, is a lot of talk about the use of technology, taking away people's rights, etc., etc. How do you work out in an organization on the fly? What is that public value thing that you're going to communicate to a broader population, but you're also going to use for yourself as a driver for your behavior? And how do you work out some of the tensions and even some of the trade-offs that you have to think about regarding public value in this case?
Yeah, well, this is, so I don't know whether it's okay, but you and I could use some technical language here a little bit, which is
Go for it.
for a minute that we had an objective function or a social objective function. And somebody asked the question, well, what's our social objective function with respect to the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic? And, you start off with a fairly obvious one, which is, well, we'd like to minimize the total number of deaths, and we'd like to minimize the total amount of morbidity and stuff that would be associated with the epidemic. And we can all get pretty head up concentrating on doing that. And to a certain extent, you can feel the public health people sort of marching to the fore and nominating that dimension of value, health, less fatalities, et cetera, as the only dominant value. We should spend all our money. We should give up lots of things in our life in order to accomplish this. And it's true that that's the one that is salient and will mobilize a lot of action and ought to be the thing. So we need to have that as something that motivates us and also as something that guides and directs and controls our action. We're motivated to it because we want to save lives. We want to do it, we know how to do it because we know that these are the methods that would be necessary to save the lives, okay? But then what often happens is that one-dimensional, although it's not really one dimension, it's kind of a complicated vector of things, but it's in one large index, if you will, that sort of says public health is the stuff we're after here. Another index pops up and it sort of says, well, wait a minute, well, we're having this big impact on our economy, right? And that's a non-trivial thing as well. And we're paying a huge price for that. I wonder whether anybody's paying close attention to that or not, right? And so then you get, a lot of people come sweeping in and sort of saying, well, that's an important objective too. So we've got two big social arguments in the utility function. One of them is to stop the illness and the other is to minimize the economic impact. And then that complicates the design of the social response, all right? Because we have to do things to accomplish both of those objectives, not just one, right? And as you suggest, that raises the question of trade-offs, right? But I think we waste an enormous amount of time talking about the trade-offs, right? Because I think a lot of times, we don't know exactly, we're not on the production possibility frontier. We're well inside it, right? And we don't know what the trade-offs are, right? We know that both of these are important objectives. So we have to try stuff that will accomplish both objectives, ideally, all right? And if somebody says, political systems are terrible at assigning weights to arguments of utility functions, right? But they're very good at reminding us that there's another dimension of value out there that we ought to be paying attention to, right? And so then we're stuck there with our limited brains and our limited knowledge to try to think about those things. But if we've got them both in mind, chances are we're going to do better without that. So far, everything I've talked about has to do with utility, all right?
Mhm.
And we could go further and say, gee, we're going to have a lot of fraud. We're going to have a lot of price gouging. We're going to have you know, in the things we do in the economy. And we're going to make a lot of mistakes and people are going to die on the other side. So bad stuff is going to happen with respect to both of these dimensions in utilitarian perspectives, right? But then you know damn well that somebody at some stage is going to come out and say, well, are we doing this fairly and justly? Are the burdens being distributed in a way that's consistent with our understanding of our rights and responsibilities to one another, right? Are the effects we're having properly distributed between burdens and benefits, right? And so then you have to add sort of a different dimension of public value in this, which is the degree to which we think we have a good idea and are living up to an idea of what we might owe to one another and what in the course of experiencing and acting on this epidemic. And so, and again, and that'll show up when we begin seeing people, you know, shutting off their neighborhoods, all right, or attacking Asians in the street, all right, because they think they've been spreading the disease. So there's a part of this that has to do with the management of civility and right relationships, as well as the economic effects and the health effects. And so, as I say, you can get all in a lather about, oh my goodness, it's gotten so complicated now, and we have to be observing the effects of our actions on so many different dimensions of value. And we're going to have so many different instruments to deal with each of the particular effects, all right? But, and so again, the chances of being able to come down and make a rational synoptic decision that optimizes our response in that situation is virtually nil, right? And what you want the value framework to do is to alert you to places where things are going wrong, right? So again, going back to this metaphor, that what we're trying to do is keep in front of people a picture not so much of, quote, the problem, but essentially the values that are at stake in the problem and the way in which we're responding to it, all right, in both the short and the long run. And I actually have a lot of confidence in human brains to cope with that kind of complexity, all right, and make a reasonably good judgment in the face of it, all right? But if you ask them to compute it by assigning weights to each of those dimensions of value, they'll give up, all right? They just won't be able to do it. So what I think is the mistake is to allow ourselves to get focused on only one value. Many people would recommend that because that simplifies the problems and allows us to make the calculation. But it doesn't mobilize everybody. And it doesn't identify the things that we have at stake that we have to manage for, right? If we could get accustomed with dealing with multiple objectives and not sweat it so much with this analytic problem of how we're going to optimize, you know, over a large set of values using a complex portfolio that's dynamic, you know, policy instruments. Okay, but the other thing that's cool about that is that when the values will pop up as people begin experiencing wrongs, you know, where difficulties arise. And then people begin making a response, and we'll be able to fashion out of that response some larger effort that will give that thing an appropriate standing. If we were spending all our time now worrying about vigilantism, that would be a big mistake, right? Yeah. It's not a big problem yet, but it's going to be out there someplace, and price gouging is going to be out there someplace as well. So, you know, you just, the good thing is that you've got a large number of people mobilized.
Yeah. So
they're mobilized and alert to the values. Something's going to happen.
Yeah. So it sounds like having multiple values is a good thing and not a bad thing, because it mobilizes lots of different people, and different people are going to be mobilized by different values in the system.
That's my view.
Yeah.
And they'll be in different positions to take action on those.
Right. So if you are there, do you need to, should you be aware of the values that you are most concerned about, the ones that you are trying to move positively towards, and the ones that maybe you're trying to kind of defend, and the ones that
minimize?
Yeah. How do you have any framework that people could use to kind of practically think about that?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, the book that I wrote on recognizing public value sort of is designed to encourages people to construct something called a public value account. And if we were to take that back to our earlier discussion about talking about where the work is and what it is that we ought to be paying attention to, right? That's what that is.
That's what that is.
Account, right? And the public value account is a set of dimensions, each of which may have a metric, all right? But each of which also ought to have a vivid image and a story behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's those different dimensions and metrics that allow us to keep track. And, you know, again, we don't have to optimize for all at a particular moment in time, particularly not in a crisis. We may have to sort of adjust and adapt as we learn not only about the methods, but also about the values that are at stake.
Yeah, and some of those values might change over time as well. The things that come, as you said, you know, you're going to run into new things and they're going to raise new value questions for you.
It's interesting. It's not that the values change. It's that the set of values moves around.
Interesting.
So new things get added, old things get subtracted. Some issues become much more important, other issues become less. But there's always a latent structure of values there, which if we're aware of would be, and which we could help others be aware of, would invite different kinds of action from different people, right? That's the other thing, is to realize when you're thinking about this, you know, you tend to focus on big organizations with a lot of power and stuff like that. But, you know, go back to my image of the ants, right? There's a hell of a lot of work that's being done by individuals, families, all on their own, right? I don't mean to glorify that or make that, but it is there, and we ought to be aware of it, and we ought to be grateful for it, and we ought to be able to channel it and take advantage of it.
Yeah. So one of the cases that I've been following in the last little while is the case in Bahrain with a student of ours, Hamad Al-Malki, who was a mid-career Mason, I think in 2012, 2013. And Hamad, when they started out, they identified 3 different dimensions of work, and it very much sounds like a snowflake. They had a central group that was coordinating and that was responsible for essentially developing the information systems. Then they had a set of medical teams,
experts,
a set of economic
providers,
teams, and then they had a set of teams focused on the social aspect. And it sounds very much like almost kind of 3 different value bases, and not having a trade-off, and not saying, well, we're just going to work with you, and we're going to basically from the start saying, you guys are focused on that thing, and that's what drives you, and that's what kind of really gets you going, and we want you to run with that as hard as possible.
Absolutely.
And you guys are on a different trajectory, and we want you to run as hard as possible, and then you guys on the social side run as hard as possible. Right. And then the social people were giving them advice on kind of what to do with schools and education, etc. The economic people were saying, here's where the fears are. And it's very interesting also that the response that they had was very much to the fears. It's fears about those values, right? This isn't people aren't being technically responsive. They're being viscerally responsive.
Right.
And saying, you know, tell us what they are and tell us what you need. And on the medical side, and why I was asking the question about this, because they started the war room before they had their first case. And they had all of them working harder than they ever have before, before they had a case, in preparation, which is a very difficult thing to do. But then when they, the day that they closed most of the kind of the stores and restaurants, etc., that moment, which I think every country is going through, on exactly that day, they also announced the economic package. They announced all the other things. And it was very interesting because in your language, I guess you'd say you had multiple values being represented at one time. And so anybody sitting at home, some people are scared about the public health aspect and you have a response. Some people are scared about the economic. You're playing to that. Some people are asking questions about social matters. You're responding to that. And so what you really want to do, it gets back to the organization too, is you want to have those ants scurrying around, mobilized by what value that they have. And then you at the middle want to be able to kind of just see how those things flow with each other as well. Yeah.
And how much energy there is behind it. And that's on the production side. Going back to the strategic triangle, that tells you how much energy there is in the authorizing environment, right? But then there's also the interesting question about how big is the problem on the public values side. So we have too much energy in this one right at the moment, right? and not enough in some place over here, right?
Yeah.
But another way to think about that is that attached to each of those values is what you could describe as a value chain or a production process. Right? That's a set of resources that are being deployed through some organizations using particular means to deal with that particular piece of the problem, all right? And it's possible then to take each of those values and to imagine what it would take, and that's probably what those committees did. You know, what do we need to do on the social side? What do we need to do on the health side? And as long as they run independently and aren't claiming the same set of resources, I mean, you know, again, this is where economists lead us astray because they keep imagining that there's an opportunity cost and we ought to be calculating these margins and stuff, but it's impossible to do. So if there's enough resources, you know, if there's a certain amount of resources, let's get the most out of those that we can right at the moment, right? With respect to that particular thing, and not worry too much about, you know, whether we should be reallocating resources radically from one place to another. So it's, you know, the requirements of rational optimization, all right, cannot be met, all right, even in non-crisis situations, right,
Yeah.
let alone in crisis situations, all right? So to imagine that what a good response does is look like a effort to step back and figure out rationally the optimization across all dimensions of value using all resources optimally is nuts.
So it sounds like in a sense you're saying, at least in this point, but maybe all the time, but at least in this point, you need to put the cost benefit analysis away for a period of time, and you need to focus a little bit on where the energy is.
That's
Focus on where the energy is and go where the energy is, and where you can learn the most.
Yeah, when you may remember, I wrote a paper at one stage on learning while doing.
Yep.
And one of the models was essentially the rational centralized R&D control. This was about how innovation would happen, right? And the idea was that, well, we shouldn't try something that we don't know is going to work because that would be irresponsible, right? And we should wait until the social scientists tell us that something works before we do anything, right? And that was one end of the model that I was working on. The other end of the model was the civil rights movement in the United States. And basically the way the civil rights movement worked in the United States, they didn't stand around and try to figure out whether it was better to, you know, to occupy the lunch counters or to sing songs or to...
Just did them all.
What they did was they looked around the country for anyone who was in motion and they sent resources to it.
Mm-hmm.
And because there the issue was not so much the method for accomplishing the job. The question was where was the will to act, right? Okay. Now, in most situations, you need both a will to act and a competent methodology. Yeah. But if you put the balance too much on the methodology, all right, then everything slows down. If you put too much emphasis on the will, then you get a reasonable amount of feckless or wasted effort. But if the price of discouraging that feckless or wasted effort is that you essentially turn off a person who is willing to contribute, right? It's not clear that that's a great, this is a really weird example of it, but when I was doing work in the nonprofit sector and on the American Red Cross, right? The American Red Cross faced this very interesting, challenging problem, which was what were they going to do with people who wanted to contribute blood, but couldn't pass a test that guaranteed that their blood was safe, all right? Now, this is really an interesting question, right? Because in some sense, you want everybody to apply, right? But if you do that and you have this test, then you end up saying to some people, you know, I'm sorry, you don't pass and we can't use your blood and it was a waste of your time, right? Mm. So the question is if you were the American Red Cross, how would you deal with that situation? Well, you certainly wouldn't give the tainted blood to people who needed it, right? Yeah. But on the other hand, you did have to have some kind of response to the people who were showing up and volunteering when their blood couldn't be used, right? And so a similar thing is, you know, if you were focusing on efficiency and effectiveness of the blood supply, you'd put up signs and you say, don't come in if you have any of the following characteristics and, you know, go away, we don't need you, and say, oh, I'm sorry, you know, and then destroy the blood. But, you know, so maybe somebody shows up and you say to them, well, you know, we can't use your blood, but we could use you in these other ways.
Exactly.
Right? And so that's, it seems to me that, so whenever any will shows up, it's a little bit like bumping into people that, making the contribution you'd like to make is actually not so helpful, but there are other contributions you can make, and let's figure out what those are.
It's very interesting. I find in a lot of the PDIA work that we do, people say to me, what is this all about? And I say, it's all about channeling volition.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all about, the Talbot in Yenswa, who was from Liberia, I asked him at the end, I said, what motivated you to do this work? And he said something to the effect of, we do this because we want to serve our people. And right. he said, there are many, many people who want that. He said, for me, the crisis just created the opportunity to actually do it.
Absolutely.
And it's a very interesting thing that I think sometimes we look and we say there's a leadership deficiency, but I really believe the leadership deficiency is much more about the structures that we have that don't create opportunities for the volition that is there. And
I agree.
So if the volition is there, channel it, move it, but don't squash it, right?
That's
and if
exactly
the
right.
isn't there, maybe create opportunities for it, which even in the face of a crisis, one of the things that I think we see is in every single country, the call for volunteers is always oversubscribed.
Absolutely.
It's always oversubscribed. And I think it tells us that you don't need all the resources, the best practice, because you have people, but right. You have to give them the opportunity to put their hand up. And they will. And I really believe that. Mark, I've spent a lot of time on the line with you. I wonder if we could finish off with maybe you just giving some thoughts for, directly the people who are on the front lines now. We have many of our former students who are running these things.
Yeah.
I'm concerned for them. I'm concerned for their health. I'm concerned for their well-being. I think they have immense volition, but maybe they don't look after themselves through this period. And I wonder if you have any kind of messages that you can give to them about kind of just moderating themselves, managing themselves in the face of a crisis response.
Oh, boy. Yeah, I think, one of the lessons I think we've learned about leadership and management at the Kennedy School is that it is really hard work, and it takes an awful lot out of people, right, if they're doing it right, and if you're doing it authentically and seriously and stuff. It's emotionally very challenging and difficult. And so, and many of the people who want to do this work in the public sector are people who are very hostile to and averse to self-serving motives, all right, and to selfishness. They think that's bad. But I think it takes a mature person to understand that if you're going to be of any use to others, you've got to do a little bit of taking care of yourself, all right? And that can come in a lot of different forms. It can come in the form of rest. It can come in the form of celebration when you've accomplished something together. It can come in the form of reflection and prayer and stuff like that. But if you burn yourself out, you're not useful to anybody. And in the same way, you're not particularly useful to anybody if you martyr yourself, although both might feel great to somebody who wants reassurances that they really do care about what it is that they're doing. Well, you got to care about yourself as well as the others. And you got to take some time out from serving others to help yourself to have the energy to go forward.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
And I'll be in touch, I'm sure, again soon to tell you a little bit about what folks say about these things. We're actually having a regular call every Friday, 9 a.m. We had 60 people on the week before last, 70 people on this week, all over the world.
Great.
If you want to call in, I'll send you the details of it. We'd love to have you offering your wisdom to people, but thank you for giving it to us this afternoon.
Matt, I'm astonished by your resourcefulness, and I hope you're doing enough for yourself. So
I am.
in the future. Okay.
Thank you, Mark. Okay.